Well, a few weeks ago, I was approached by another church in the city who were looking to spend some time with me to ask some questions and maybe have some input or guidance provided. The nature of their questions and their request is an occurrence that's happened with some frequency over the last 10 years, and it's usually phrased something like this. We've heard of all the things you're doing in your local community and the impact that your church is having on the neighborhood. What do you do? And how can we have that kind of impact? And I'd say most of the time, it's seen as a simplistic request, thinking there's some sort of magical formula or recipe to help achieve this goal. Well, when I get these phone calls or emails, I usually answer with what has become my standard response and typically results in the conversation being navigated to a close rather quickly. My response has two parts. But usually we only make it through the first part, which goes something like this. You want to know how to make an impact? Find something to do that your neighborhood needs, and then do it for 10 years, and come back and ask the question again. And at that, you can usually cue the cricket soundtrack as we chit-chat a little bit and they say goodbye. Now, I'm not trying to be snarky with my answer. It actually is quite a genuine answer because I fundamentally believe that any successes we've had in engaging our neighborhood as a church are not the result of some sort of formula or program, but the result of our consistency and commitment to being present in the needs for the long term with no strings attached, and to keeping our ears and eyes open to discover what the needs are. Sometimes, occasionally, in these conversations, I can sense a bit of an appetite to dig further and a curiosity to explore this. And this was certainly my experience a few weeks ago with this church. After my first answer over the phone, they decided to send a team of 5 people to come and talk further and to explore this and to have a very open and honest conversation. And I loved it. And it was during this meeting that I shared the second part of my answer to this question, which has been a foundational conviction that I've carried for as long as I've been in the role that I'm in, and something that I hope I will never lose sight of in my own life. A value that was really a part of the DNA that first compelled our small little group to start this church more than 25 years ago, and it's found in James chapter 2. So with this team of 5 sitting around the table, I flipped open this anchor passage from James and I read these words. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. Genuine faith is not found in sentiment. It's discovered in action. And then I can't help but get on my soapbox and say things like, when a mother and her kids are in an unsafe place and experiencing the worst kind of abuses or violence, the gospel is not found in sentiment and words, but in actually showing up and helping them find a place of safety and getting in the middle of the risk with them and maybe driving them to a shelter or standing beside them as they look desperately for help. When somebody's without a safe place to stay, what good is it to wish them well and to be on our way with some sort of spiritually toned sentiment and then move along? No, not at all. The gospel is experienced in the long-term and very complex levels of support needed to help find a place to call home and to provide the supports that they need to stay there. And then a line I will often find myself saying is this: by and large, most people have heard the gospel message from a church at some point in their lives, but I'm not so sure that most people have had the opportunity to experience it from them. Now, if you've been hanging around here as of late, you'll know that we've committed this year to what we're calling a year with Jesus, reading a chapter each weekday as we make our way through the entire New Testament together. Hopefully you've been tracking along with us. And this past week, we found ourselves reading through Matthew 21 through 25. And the unmistakable theme that arose for me is much around this idea that the kind of faith Jesus is inviting us into is not to be found in sentiment, something to just be associated with or labeled with. It isn't an affiliation. It must be anchored in action. It must become vocational for our lives. I don't mean go get a job at a church. What I mean is that we intentionally weave into every part of our lives these kinds of dramatic reenactments of the gospel to the world around us. Together, I want to walk through 8 different images that Jesus paints for us through his parables, and hopefully you'll be able to see just how strongly Jesus pushed us towards understanding our faith as a vocation housed in action in the kind of kingdom that he was building. So to set the stage for these 8 images, we'll first look at a key moment in chapter 21 as we discover Jesus in one of the most dramatic scenes during his time on earth. The entire city of Jerusalem has just been stirred up. It was Passover, so it was likely between 300 or 400,000 additional people that had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The city is packed, and Jesus has just entered through the gates riding on the back of a donkey as these massive crowds gathered to see what was happening. A parade, loud noises, cheers, and shouts. I mean, it was a major event, and all of the attention was on him. And we read about how Jesus walked from there into the temple, the very center of activity of the Jewish faith, packed with those visiting for Passover, the temple courts filled with merchants selling birds and livestock for their sacrificial practices that they had come to participate in, with all hands on deck, hundreds of staff and priests operating the temple. I mean, it was a bustling place full of activity of all kinds, religious, economic, all the crowds. And then we read in verse 12 and 13, that Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And then he says, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." I mean, what a scene. Tables flying through the air, coins scattering out as the money boxes tip over, people scrambling out of the way, birds and feathers everywhere. And Jesus seems quite indignant about all of this commercial activity happening there in the temple. I remember a number of years ago fielding an email concern, one of those emails that carried a bit of an extra sting in the tone. The issue at hand was that we had set up a giant marketplace in the center of our foyer for a shopping event during the Christmas season. The market was selling all of the handmade products from the women in Eswatini, where we support our care points that care for the children of that community. These items were made as income-generating activity for these women so they could also support their families while caring for the kids that we were sponsoring. And in the email, they concluded that we were being very ignorant about this very passage and operating in full contradiction, and that if Jesus were to walk into our church at this moment, he'd be infuriated, much as the way he walked into the temple that day to find all these markets in full swing, and that we had lost our way in staying in step with the Bible. And fair enough, I suppose. We were literally running a marketplace in church. So, had we lost our way? Well, Jesus' words seem quite pointed. "You've made my house of prayer into a den of robbers." This place is meant to be a place of prayer where you can escape the worldly quest for money and wealth, bombarded with advertisements of buying more to make you happy. But this place should be a place of contemplative prayer, encountering God free from these worldly things, right? And here we were with all these purses and bags and even jewelry, bright fluorescent sale signs and Interact machines everywhere. I mean, perhaps at first glance, it would seem like we had indeed lost our way. And maybe you might even agree with this criticism. But as we take a second glance, I think we discover something else that comes into focus. You see, in verse 13, one of our clues of where to look comes when Jesus says these words, "It is written." We discover that these are actually phrases that Jesus is quoting and can trace it all the way back to the words of the prophet Jeremiah 600 years earlier. Jeremiah was a prophet sent to Israel to confront the Israelites with their false and insincere worship, where they paid lip service to God, but all the while they were caught up in greed and turning a blind eye to the injustices in the world around them resulting from their corruption. And here's where Jesus is quoting from in Jeremiah 7. He says this, "Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come to these gates to worship the Lord. This is the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel." What he says is, reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in the deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. And in verse 11 says this, "Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I've been watching, declares the Lord." You see, the issue that Jesus is quoting back to, the issue Jesus is calling out as he flips tables and creates this passionate and dramatic scene, tables on end, money everywhere, and this intense activity that's happening in the temple just screeches to a halt in silence. And with a raised voice and an intense voice, Jesus quotes these words. It would have been as pointed as to say this, "Listen, everyone, you've lost your way. This place was meant to embody God's presence and character, but your words and your tributes here claiming that you are following him are empty when you neglect to act the way I have asked. This has all become just sentiment. It's hollow, it's shallow, because your actions are not matching. The activity in this temple has become oppressive. The poor are being left to the sidelines. And this has all become about some sort of power or status that you think you're achieving here. True worship, true commitment, true religion is discovered when you put God's ways into action in your life. So, back to my angry email. When we understand the context of Jesus flipping tables in the temple, what do you think my conclusion was? As we take these handmade items from women who selflessly and sacrificially gave themselves every day to caring for the children who had no family or no food. And we took these items and unashamedly marked up the prices way too high, only to send every penny back to help support them and their families. Was this in some way violating God's temple? Would Jesus have started flipping our tables and cash machines across the room? Well, I guess you can probably figure out where I stand on that one. Needless to say, the very first draft of my email response needed a little bit of massaging before hitting the reply button. But in all honesty, looking deeper into this event, understanding the context and the frustrations that Jesus held, what would his response be as he walked into this space? Are we known as a people who put into action the things that matter to God in response to our faith and worship of him? Or are we mostly caught in lip service, carrying a sentiment of faith or an affiliation with it, but all the while the activity of our lives doesn't really hit the pavement on what truly matters to God? Well, framed in this question in a few moments, I want us to look together at 8 different images that Jesus paints for us in the chapters immediately following this moment. And I think we'll discover what James 2 reiterates so clearly for us. Faith that is stuck in sentiment, what good is it? Faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, James says, is dead. James chapter 2, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you goes to them and says, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. Genuine faith is not found in sentiment, but is found in action. It's found as we become actors in the drama that unfolds around us, reenacting the character and the kingdom of God to the world around us. In all of its brokenness, in all the injustice that we see, and in the struggle and pain that we encounter. 8 simple images that we discovered in our journey through Matthew this past week that together create a compounding and compelling challenge for us to see that Jesus cared deeply about us understanding this. First is the fig tree. In verse 18 and 19, it says this: "In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but leaves. And he said, 'May no fruit ever come from you again.' And the fig tree withered at once." So in the very hours following the incident with the tables in the temple, Jesus' followers were in tow, and this happens. Jesus is hungry, and he's looking for something to eat, and he sees a fig tree. What is it that we would expect from a fig tree? To produce figs. And so he walks up to it and discovers this tree is not doing what it was expected to do. Its real purpose for existence. And so Jesus curses it, and it withers. Picture number 2, the parable of the 2 sons. In verse 28, we read, "What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' And he answered, 'I will not.' But afterward, he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same, and he answered, 'I will, sir,' but did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of the Father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly, I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you." One son, when asked to take on the duties of the father, says no, but actually ends up going and doing it. And the other says an enthusiastic yes, but neglects to take any action. Which one understood what it was to be a part of God's kingdom? And it's interesting here because it is the unexpected characters who are the ones that are actually figuring this out and enacting the kingdom of God. And the ones holding on to the label as yes folk miss it. Third picture was a wedding banquet. In chapter 22, we read, "And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants saying, "Tell those who are invited, see, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast." But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants and treated them shamefully and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent troops to destroy those murderers and burn their city. And then he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go, therefore, to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you can find." And so those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both the bad and the good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. This one's interesting. A father holds a banquet feast for his son and sends the message to all of the invited guests to come, but they weren't interested. This amazing spread is ready and the feast is set. The meat's been smoked to perfection and everything is set up, and yet they don't come. We're told they had too many other things that were in their focus. One to his field, another to his business. These things took priority. So with no guests, they head to the street corners and tell anyone who's willing to come, and they did. And once again, those who were supposedly the guests of honor were distracted and consumed with the busyness or seeming importance of what they deemed valuable in their lives and entirely ignored the invitation to join in the feast of the kingdom. And those who were least expected end up being the ones who join in. Is it starting to come into focus yet? The fourth and fifth picture come as Jesus gives warning to his followers. In chapter 23, we read that Jesus says to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees, all these leaders, they sit in Moses' seat. So observe whatever they tell you, but not the works that they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. And then in verse 23, we read, woe to you, to the scribes, to these Pharisees, you're hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. These leaders, these Pharisees who can't keep their mouths shut, yet they don't lift a finger. They're filled with hollow sentiment, but no action. They preach, but they don't practice. And then they go and tithe their mint and dill and cumin, implying that it's right down to the smallest detail, that they're attempting to do everything they need to do to appear religiously elite. And yet, what harsh judgment does Jesus hold for them? He says, you've neglected what really matters: justice, mercy, faithfulness. Find a need in your neighborhood and do something for 10 years. Justice, faithfulness. Okay, a couple more. Picture number 6 is 2 men in a field. This one's a classically misused passage. In verse 37, it says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will it be in the coming of the Son of Man. There will be 2 men in a field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taking. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Now, if you've been around a church for any length of time, you may recognize this imagery as the inspiration for movements like Left Behind, where there's this picture painted of Jesus coming back to take his people away, and suddenly one person is snatched and vanished, often pictured with sort of a pile of clothes that fall to the ground and no body left. And the other was left behind. Well, if you actually think about this passage, it's the reverse. The picture is of Jesus returning to the earth, looking for those who are actually actively living out his new kingdom here on earth. In this context, it was not those left behind who had missed the mark. But the real point of these words are discovered in verse 45 and 46. It says this, who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. The point of being ready is to be living out what we've been called to do here in the world around us. And if Jesus were to show up, would he find us actively living out what he has asked us to do? We're almost there. Picture number 7, parable of the bags of gold. In verse 1, it says, God's kingdom will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. And then we read about how the master gives one servant 5 bags of gold, one 2 bags, another 1 bag, and each of them chooses what they will do while they wait for their master to return. The first puts the money to work and earns 5 more. The second does the same and doubles his money. But the third was afraid of losing it and making the master mad, so he buries it and hides it until he returns. And when the master returns, he celebrates the first 2, how they put what he entrusted them to work, and has very harsh words for the last one who chose to hide it away. The point of this parable wasn't how much gold you carried or even how much you had made from it, but rather that you had taken what you had been given and put it into action. Well, the final of our 8 images we discover is in chapter 25, and it's a picture of the sheep and the goats. And this one I'm simply going to read for you. When he finally arrives, blazing in beauty, and all his angels with him, the Son of Man will take his place on the glorious throne. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort the people out, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting sheep to the right and goats to the left. And the king will say to those who are on his right, "Enter, you who are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation, and here's why. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you gave me a room. I was shivering, and you gave me clothes. I was sick, and you stopped to visit, and I was in prison, and you came to me." Then those sheep are going to say to the master, "What are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will say, "I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me." And then he will turn to the goats, the ones on the left, and say, "Get out, you worthless goats. You're good for nothing but the fires of hell." Why? Because I was hungry, and you gave me no meal. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was homeless, and you gave me no bed. I was shivering, and you gave me no clothes, sick and in prison, and you never visited. And then these goats are going to say, "Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or homeless or shivering or sick or in prison and didn't help?" And he'll answer, "I'm telling you the solemn truth. Whenever you failed to do one of these things to someone who is being overlooked or ignored, that was me. You failed to do it to me." And those goats will be herded into their eternal doom, but the sheep to their eternal reward. So with these 8 images, I ask you again, if Jesus were to show up here, do you think he'd be flipping our tables and our welcome centers and our grounded cafe and syrups and coffee everywhere and papers flying all over the place? If Jesus showed up unannounced, would he find us actively doing the work of the kingdom, or cruising along with our own agendas, distracted by a million other things? If he came by to see what we'd been doing with the gifts and the talents and the resources that he's entrusted to us, what would he discover? Well, I think the answers to these questions is whether or not we have bought into a faith of tokenism, of affiliation or sentiment, or whether our faith indeed propels us to the very gutsy actions that are working towards God's kingdom being made known to the world around us as we respond to the brokenness that we encounter, to the injustices that we see. And God makes it clear for us: justice, mercy, faithfulness. These are the important matters that we've been asked to be defined by. And I think if we neglect these matters, he might say, if he walks into this space, "What good is all of this?" This is what compels us as a church to invest so much of our energy and resource and value into this work. Why we've invested the last 3 years into the building of Riverwood House to respond to the overwhelming needs of addiction and homelessness that we see in our city. Why we're currently doubling down on our efforts and renovating our fire hall space to be the very best space we can make for our neighborhood to access the supports that we provide. And why we've been relentlessly committed to staying in the middle of the need and the struggles of our neighborhood at any cost for the past 20 years, and why we intend to for the next 20. Church, the faith that we are called to is not a faith of sentiment or hollow words. The gospel Jesus invites us into, the kingdom God is building, is one that's discovered in the gutsy action of working towards the restoration of the world around us in all of its brokenness, to restore justice and wholeness in the places of need. It's a faith that can only be discovered in action. I want to take a moment to celebrate how so many of you put these words into action last weekend in one of my favorite events that we call Trash the Neighborhood. What a spectacular day it was. Over 230 Riverwooders gathered together to serve our neighborhood, and this is what it looked like. Church, what a spectacular day. We filled up 9 commercial bins and totaled 23 tons of garbage removed from our neighborhood. This is insane. I want to say a huge thanks to Hallright for your partnership and to the City of Winnipeg for waiving all the dumping fees. And thank you to every one of you who came out to make this such an incredible day with our community. It had a remarkable impact. Church, may we continue to carry this vision forward of not being content to leave the gospel Jesus entrusted to us lost in sentiment, but a gutsy gospel that's actually experienced through the actions of those of us relentlessly committed to putting into action the kind of kingdom that Jesus invites us into.